The tiny wolf pup was barely clinging to life, blood matting its silver fur as it lay motionless beside the rain-soaked highway. And he, a battle-worn single father who had built walls around his heart after losing everything that mattered, had every reason to keep driving through the storm. But he didn't. That one choice, made on a desolate mountain road where cell towers couldn't reach, would bring a wildlife biologist into his world who would shatter every defense he'd carefully constructed. If you believe in the healing power of unexpected connections, in love that blooms from the most unlikely encounters, and in the way broken souls can mend each other while saving something wild and beautiful, this is a story that will restore your faith in second chances. Subscribe to discover more heartwarming journeys of transformation just like this one. Now, let's begin this remarkable tale of courage, compassion, and a love that changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The October rain hammered against the windshield of Calvin Drovich's battered pickup truck with the relentless fury of a storm that had been building for days. Through the rhythmic sweep of worn wipers, the winding mountain highway stretched ahead like a dark ribbon, barely visible in the gloom of early evening. Calvin gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white against the cracked leather, and squinted through the downpour at the treacherous curves of Thornfield Pass. He knew these roads well, had driven them countless times during his years working construction in the remote corners of Pine Valley County. Every pothole, every sharp turn, every place where the asphalt crumbled away into steep ravines that could swallow a vehicle whole. Tonight, though, the familiar felt dangerous. The storm had been battering the region for 3 days straight, turning normally manageable mountain roads into hazardous obstacle courses. Calvin's 11-year-old son, Ethan, sat beside him in the passenger seat, earbuds in, lost in whatever game was glowing on his tablet screen. The boy hadn't looked up from the device in over an hour, which suited Calvin just fine. Conversations between them had grown increasingly strained over the past year, ever since Sarah's death had left them both adrift in a house that felt too quiet, too empty, too full of memories neither of them knew how to process. The boy had his mother's dark hair and thoughtful eyes, but where Sarah had been warm and expressive, Ethan had become withdrawn, building walls that Calvin didn't know how to scale. Maybe it was genetics. Calvin had never been much of a talker either. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was just the natural distance that seemed to grow between fathers and sons when mothers weren't there to bridge the gap. Calvin adjusted the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of his own reflection-weathered face, gray threading through brown hair that had once been as dark as Ethan's, lines around his eyes that had deepened considerably in the 18 months since Sarah's car accident. At 38, he felt older than his years, like someone who had seen too much and lost too much to believe in easy endings anymore. The windshield wipers struggled against the increasing downpour, and Calvin leaned forward, trying to make out the road ahead. They were returning from a weekend visit to Sarah's parents in Millbrook, a monthly obligation that had become increasingly difficult for all involved. Ethan's grandparents meant well, but their house was a shrine to their deceased daughter, filled with photos and memories that seemed to emphasize everything that was missing from Calvin and Ethan's daily life. Calvin had served 2 tours overseas before meeting Sarah, had seen enough combat to know how trauma could hollow a person out from the inside. But nothing in his military experience had prepared him for the particular kind of warfare that grief waged on a household, the way it could turn ordinary objects into landmines, the way it could make a father and son feel like strangers sharing the same address. The radio crackled with a weather advisory, the announcer's voice cutting through the static to warn of flash flood conditions and potential road closures throughout the mountain region. Calvin reached for the volume knob, then froze as his headlights caught something in the road ahead. At first, he thought it was debris, a fallen branch or chunk of rock washed down from the hillside by the storm. But as he slowed the truck and the headlights illuminated the shape more clearly, Calvin's heart lurched. It was an animal, small and gray, lying motionless in the middle of the asphalt. Calvin pulled over to the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires, and put the truck in park. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he could see the creature more clearly now, too large to be a domestic dog, too small to be an adult wolf. Its fur was matted with blood and rain, and it hadn't moved since his headlights first caught it. "Dad?" Ethan looked up from his tablet for the first time in an hour, pulling out one earbud. "Why did we stop?" "There's an animal in the road," Calvin said, already reaching for his rain jacket. "Looks hurt." Ethan leaned forward, pressing his face to the passenger window. "Is it dead?" Calvin shrugged into his jacket and reached for the door handle. "I don't know yet." "Stay in the truck." The rain hit him like a cold slap as soon as he stepped outside, soaking through his jacket within seconds. Calvin jogged toward the motionless form in the road, his boots splashing through puddles that reflected his headlights in fractured patterns. As he got closer, his suspicions were confirmed. It was definitely a wolf pup, maybe 4 or 5 months old, with the distinctive pointed ears and elongated snout that marked it as wild rather than domestic. Calvin knelt beside the animal, rain streaming down his face, and gently placed a hand near its muzzle. He could feel warm breath against his palm, faint, but there. The pup was alive, but barely. Blood matted the silver-gray fur around its left hind leg, and Calvin could see where the bone was bent at an unnatural angle. Probably hit by a vehicle and left for dead on this remote stretch of highway. Looking at the injured animal, Calvin felt something twist in his chest, a familiar ache that had nothing to do with the storm or the cold. It was the same helplessness he'd felt in the hospital when Sarah was dying, the same crushing weight of watching something fragile slip away while he stood, powerless to stop it. He should get back in the truck, drive around the animal and continue home. Getting involved would only complicate an already difficult life, and wild animals were dangerous, even injured ones. There was no cell service on this part of the highway, no emergency services to call, no veterinarians within 50 miles who would treat a wolf pup anyway. But as Calvin started to stand, the pup's eyes fluttered open golden amber irises that seemed to look directly at him with an intelligence that was both wild and desperate. In that moment, Calvin self-reflected back something wounded and alone, fighting to survive in a world that seemed determined to break everything good and pure. The rain continued to pour down, turning the highway into a river of reflected light. Calvin looked back at his truck, where Ethan was watching through the passenger window with an expression Calvin hadn't seen on his son's face in months, curiosity mixed with concern. The first real emotion the boy had shown about anything in weeks. Calvin made his decision. Carefully, he slipped his arms underneath the wolf pup, lifting it as gently as possible. The animal whimpered, but didn't struggle, either too weak or too shocked to resist. Calvin could feel its heart beating rapidly against his chest as he carried it back to the truck. Its body surprisingly light, all fur and fragile bones. "Dad, what are you doing?" Ethan asked as Calvin approached the driver's side door. "We can't leave it out there to die," Calvin said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "Help me make some space in the back seat." For the first time in months, Ethan moved without argument, quickly clearing backpacks and fast food wrappers from the rear seat. Calvin climbed in, cradling the wolf pup carefully, and Ethan scrambled into the back beside him. "Is it going to be okay?" Ethan asked, his voice softer than Calvin had heard it in a long time. Calvin looked down at the injured animal in his arms, its breathing shallow but steady, those amber eyes now closed in exhaustion or unconsciousness. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we're going to try." As they drove through the storm toward home, Calvin caught sight of his son in the rearview mirror. Ethan was gently stroking the wolf pup's uninjured fur with one finger, his tablet forgotten on the seat beside him. For the first time since Sarah's death, Calvin saw something in his son's eyes that wasn't grief or withdrawal, it was hope. Calvin didn't know anything about caring for injured wildlife. He didn't know if the veterinarian in Pine Valley would even see them. He didn't know if he was making the terrible mistake that would end in heartbreak for both him and Ethan. But as he navigated the dark, rain-slicked highway toward an uncertain destination, Calvin realized he was no longer just driving through the storm. He was driving toward something. Something that felt, for the first time in 18 months, like possibility. 18 months like possibility. The Pine Valley Emergency Veterinary Clinic was a small, single-story building tucked between a hardware store and a diner on the town's main street. At 9:30 on a stormy Sunday night, it was the only building still showing lights, though Calvin wasn't sure if that meant they were open or if someone had simply forgotten to turn off the fluorescents before leaving for the evening. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Calvin parked as close to the entrance as possible, the wolf pup still cradled in his arms. Wrapped now in an old blanket Ethan had found in the truck's emergency kit. The animal had remained unconscious for most of the drive, its breathing steady but shallow, occasionally letting out soft whimpers that seemed to come from deep in its dreams. "You think they'll help?" Ethan asked, hovering close to his father's shoulder as they approached the clinic's glass doors. "We're about to find out," Calvin replied, though he wasn't optimistic. Most veterinarians he knew focused on domestic animals, cats, dogs, the occasional farm animal. Wild wolves fell into an entirely different category, one that involved permits and wildlife agencies and complications that small town vets typically preferred to avoid. The doors were locked, but Calvin could see movement inside a middle-aged woman in scrubs moving between examination rooms, apparently cleaning up after what had been a busy evening. Calvin rapped on the glass with his knuckles, and the woman looked up. Startled, Dr. Patricia Hensley had been running the Pine Valley Clinic for nearly 15 years, and Calvin recognized her immediately. She'd treated Sarah's old golden retriever, Buster, through his final years, always with patience and compassion that had made difficult decisions a little easier to bear. When she saw Calvin standing in the rain holding what appeared to be an injured animal, she didn't hesitate to unlock the door. "Calvin Dravik," she said, stepping aside to let them enter. "What have you got there?" "Found it on Highway 47, Calvin said, water dripping from his jacket onto the clinic's tiled floor. "Hit by a car, looks like. Broken leg, maybe internal injuries." Dr. Hensley moved closer, and her expression shifted when she got a clear look at the animal in Calvin's arms. "That's a wolf pup." "Yes, ma'am. Calvin, I can't treat wild wolves. I'd need permits, specialized facilities." "This isn't a dog." Calvin had expected this response, but hearing it still felt like a door slamming shut. "So what am I supposed to do? Put it back on the highway to die?" Dr. Hensley looked at the unconscious pup, then at Ethan, who was watching the conversation with the intense focus of someone whose hope was hanging in the balance. She sighed and gestured toward the nearest examination room. "Let me take a look," she said. "I can't promise anything, but I can at least assess its condition." Calvin laid the wolf pup on the padded examination table while Dr. Hensley pulled on latex gloves and began a careful inspection. The animal stirred slightly at her touch but remained largely unresponsive, which Calvin took as either a very bad sign or a very good one. He wasn't sure which. "Definitely a broken leg," Dr. Hensley confirmed, gently manipulating the injured limb. "Clean break, though. Could heal well with proper care. No obvious internal injuries that I can detect without x-rays." She listened to the pup's breathing with a stethoscope, checked its eyes and gums. "Dehydrated, definitely in shock, but overall condition is better than it could be. Can you fix the leg?" Ethan asked. Dr. Hensley looked at Calvin. "I could set the bone, yes. But this animal belongs in a wildlife rehabilitation facility with people who specialize in wolves. The nearest one is probably 3 hours south, near Denver." Calvin felt something deflate in his chest. 3 hours in his truck, with an injured animal, through this storm, it might not survive the journey. And even if it did, he had no way of knowing whether the wildlife facility would have space, resources, or willingness to take on an injured wolf pup on a Sunday night. "What if we don't take it tonight?" Calvin asked. "What if we keep it stable until morning, then call the wildlife people?" Dr. Hensley was quiet for a long moment, studying the unconscious animal. It would need round-the-clock monitoring, medication for pain and infection, special feeding if it regains consciousness. She looked at Calvin seriously. And it would need someone to stay with it who knows what they're doing. Wolf pups aren't domestic animals. Even injured ones can be unpredictable. "I could stay," Calvin heard himself saying. "If you show me what to do." Dr. Hensley raised an eyebrow. "Calvin, this isn't like nursing a sick dog back to health. This is a wild predator. It's also just a baby," Ethan said quietly, reaching out to gently touch the pup's uninjured paw. "And it's hurt." Something in his son's voice made Calvin look at him more closely. Ethan's entire posture had changed since they'd entered the clinic. He was engaged, focused, present in a way Calvin hadn't seen since Sarah's death. The withdrawn, tablet-obsessed boy who had spent the weekend barely speaking to his grandparents was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to genuinely care about what happened to this small, injured creature. Dr. Hensley must have noticed it too, because she was watching Ethan with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said slowly, "there might be another option." Calvin waited. "I have a colleague, Dr. Rowena Drelleth. She's a wildlife biologist who works with the State Parks Department, specializes in wolf reintroduction and rehabilitation programs. She's been doing research in this area for the past few years, tracking pack movements and population dynamics." "Is she local?" "She's been staying at the research station up near Blackwater Lake for the past month, working on a project involving radio collar tracking. It's only about 40 minutes from here, even in this weather." Dr. Hensley picked up her phone. If anyone would know how to properly care for an injured wolf pup, it would be her. Calvin felt a surge of something he didn't want to name: relief, maybe, or gratitude. "You think she'd be willing to help?" Rowena's the kind of person who became a wildlife biologist because she can't stand to see animals suffer, Dr. Hensley said, already dialing. "If she's available, she'll help." The phone rang several times before a voice answered, female, professional, slightly breathless, as if the speaker had been in the middle of something physical when the call came through. "Rowena, it's Pat Hensley at the Pine Valley Clinic. I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I've got a situation here that needs your expertise." Calvin could hear only one side of the conversation, but Dr. Hensley's expression grew more optimistic as she explained the circumstances. After several minutes of back and forth, she hung up and turned to Calvin. "She's on her way," Dr. Hensley said. "Should be here within the hour. In the meantime, I'm going to set this leg and get the pup started on some fluids and antibiotics. For the next hour." Calvin and Ethan watched Dr. Hensley work with the careful precision of someone who had spent years mending broken things. She set the wolf pup's leg in a small cast, started in 4-line to combat dehydration, and administered medications that seemed to ease the animal's obvious distress. The pup regained consciousness during the procedure, those amber eyes opening to fix on Calvin with an intensity that was both grateful and wary. It didn't struggle against Dr. Hensley's treatment, but Calvin could sense the wildness in it, a core of untamed energy that remained even in injury and weakness. What happens if it can't be released back to the wild? Ethan asked as they waited. Dr. Hensley was washing her hands at the sink. "That depends on a lot of factors. The extent of the injuries, how well it heals, whether it can learn the survival skills it would need. Some wolves that are raised in captivity from an early age can't ever be released. They become too dependent on humans, lose their natural fear and hunting instincts, so it might have to live in a zoo or something, or a wildlife sanctuary. There are places that provide permanent homes for animals that can't return to the wild." Calvin looked at the wolf pup, now resting more comfortably but still connected to 4 tubes and monitors. He wondered what Sarah would have thought about this, about him stopping in a storm to rescue a wild animal, about bringing Ethan into a situation that might end in disappointment or danger. Sarah had always been the practical one in their relationship, the voice of reason that balanced Calvin's occasional impulses toward reckless compassion. But she had also been the one who insisted they stop to help stranded motorists, who donated time and money to animal shelters, who taught Ethan that caring for things weaker than yourself wasn't optional. It was what made you human. Maybe she would have understood. The clinic's front door chimed, and Calvin looked up to see a woman entering, shaking rain from a dark green jacket. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe early 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes the color of pine forests after rain. She moved with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to working outdoors, her boots and clothing suggesting she'd come directly from the field research station. "You must be Calvin," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Rowena Dralleth. Pat told me you found an injured pup on Highway 47. Calvin stood to shake her hand, surprised by the firmness of her grip. "This is my son, Ethan. We couldn't just leave it there. Ethan, we couldn't just leave it there." Rowena smiled at Ethan, then moved immediately to the examination table where the wolf pup lay. Calvin watched her work, noting the gentle but authoritative way she handled the animal, the quick assessment she made of its condition, and Dr. Hensley's treatment. "Excellent work, Pat," she said after several minutes. "This little one is lucky to be alive. What are its chances?" Calvin asked. Rowena looked at him directly, and Calvin found himself caught by the intelligence in her green eyes. "Better than they were an hour ago. The break should heal cleanly, and there don't appear to be any major internal injuries. The bigger question is what happens next, meaning this pup is probably around 4 months old, which is right at the edge of the critical socialization period. Any older, and it would be nearly impossible to rehabilitate for release. Any younger, and it would be too dependent on its pack to survive alone." She gestured toward the sleeping animal. "This one is right in the sweet spot, old enough to have basic survival instincts, young enough to still learn what it needs to know." Calvin felt Ethan move closer to his side. "So it can go back to the wild?" "With proper care and rehabilitation, yes. It's going to require several months of specialized treatment, though. Physical therapy for the leg, gradual reintroduction to appropriate foods, socialization with other wolves if possible." Rowena looked between Calvin and Ethan. "It's not a simple process." Calvin nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was agreeing to. All he knew was that for the first time in 18 months, he and his son were united in caring about something outside their own grief. Whatever came next, it felt like the beginning of something important. "What do we need to do?" he asked. Rowena's smile was warm and genuine. "First, we get this little one stable and comfortable. Then we figure out how to give it the best possible chance at the life it was meant to live." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the small veterinary clinic, Calvin felt something shift, not just in the injured wolf pup's condition, but in the space between him and Ethan, and in the way the future suddenly seemed full of possibilities he hadn't considered before. By Tuesday morning, Calvin's garage had been transformed into something resembling a makeshift wildlife rehabilitation center. The wolf pup, whom Ethan had quietly begun calling Scout, though no one had officially named the animal, was housed in a large wire enclosure that Rowena had helped Calvin construct using materials from the hardware store and her own professional knowledge of wolf behavior. The enclosure took up most of the garage's floor space, complete with elevated sleeping areas, water stations, and enough room for the pup to move around despite its cast. Rowena had been clear about the importance of providing appropriate stimulation. Even during recovery, wolves were intelligent animals that could develop behavioral problems if kept in environments that were too sterile or restrictive. Calvin stood in the doorway between the house and garage, holding his morning coffee and watching Scout eat from a bowl of specially prepared food that Rowena had shown him how to make. The pup was definitely stronger than it had been 3 days ago, its amber eyes alert and tracking movement, though it still moved carefully to avoid putting weight on its injured leg. "He's looking better," Ethan said, appearing beside Calvin in pajamas and slippers. It was the first time in months that Ethan had gotten up early voluntarily, but he'd been rising before his alarm every day since Scout's arrival, eager to check on the animal's progress. "She," Calvin corrected gently. "Rowena confirmed yesterday that Scout's female." Ethan nodded, taking the correction seriously. "She looks stronger." "More awake," Calvin had to agree. Scout's transformation over the past few days had been remarkable, from a nearly lifeless creature they'd found on the highway to an increasingly alert and engaged animal that watched their movements with obvious intelligence. Dr. Hensley had stopped by twice to check on the healing process and pronounced herself impressed with Scout's resilience. The sound of tires on gravel announced Rowena's arrival for her daily check-in. She'd been coming by every morning before heading to her research station, and every evening after finishing her field work. Officially, these visits were about monitoring Scout's medical progress and adjusting her rehabilitation plan. Unofficially, Calvin had begun to look forward to them in ways that had nothing to do with the wolf pup. "Morning," Rowena called, entering through the garage's side door with her characteristic combination of professional confidence and easy warmth. She wore field clothes, sturdy pants, hiking boots, and a fleece jacket with the state park's logo, and carried a canvas bag filled with what Calvin had learned was an impressive array of veterinary supplies and wildlife expertise. "How's our patient today?" she asked, kneeling beside Scout's enclosure. Scout immediately moved toward the side of the enclosure closest to Rowena, a behavior that had developed over the past few days. The pup seemed to have accepted Rowena as a source of both food and medical attention, though she remained wary of Calvin and especially cautious around Ethan. "Still won't let me get too close," Ethan observed, though he didn't sound disappointed. Rowena had explained that maintaining some wariness around humans was actually a positive sign for an animal that would eventually need to survive in the wild. "That's exactly what we want to see," Rowena confirmed, opening the enclosure to perform her daily examination. Scout allowed the handling but kept her attention focused on Rowena's face, as if trying to read her intentions. Too much comfort with humans would make rehabilitation much more difficult. Calvin watched Rowena work, noting the practiced way she moved around the wolf pup, the gentle efficiency of her examination technique. Over the past few days, he'd learned that she'd been studying wolves for nearly a decade, had published research on pack dynamics and territorial behavior, and had been involved in reintroduction programs across 3 different states. What the research papers and professional credentials didn't capture was the way she talked to Scout during examinations, quiet, reassuring words that seemed to calm the animal even during uncomfortable procedures, or the way she'd patiently answered every one of Ethan's increasingly detailed questions about wolf behavior, physiology, and conservation, or the way she'd somehow managed to make Calvin's garage feel less like an improvised medical facility and more like a purposeful place where something important was happening. "The cast should be able to come off in another week or so," Rowena said, finishing her examination and securing the enclosure. "Dr. Hensley wants to do another X-ray to confirm the bone is healing properly, but everything looks good so far." "What happens then?" Calvin asked. "Then the real work begins. Physical therapy to restore full mobility, dietary changes to prepare her for hunting, behavioral assessments to make sure she's developing appropriate survival instincts." Rowena stood, brushing dust from her knees. "The goal is to have her ready for a soft release by late spring." Ethan looked up from where he'd been sketching, Scout in a notebook. "What's a soft release?" "It means we don't just open a cage and push her out into the forest," Rowena explained. "We gradually introduce her to larger spaces, monitor her hunting behavior, make sure she can find food and shelter on her own." The final step would be releasing her in territory where there's an established wolf pack that might accept her. Calvin found himself wondering what would happen to their morning routine once Scout was gone. The past few days had given structure to their lives that had been missing since Sarah's death. Purpose, shared focus, something outside their own grief that demanded attention and care. Have you always worked with wolves? Ethan asked. Rowena smiled. Not always. I started out studying small mammals, mostly rodents and bats. But I did my graduate research on wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone, and I got hooked on their complexity. Wolves aren't just individual animals. They're social beings with family structures, communication systems, cultural traditions that get passed down through generations. Cultural traditions? Calvin asked. Like what? Hunting techniques, territorial boundaries, even play behaviors. Different packs develop different approaches to problem solving, and they teach those approaches to their young. It's not just instinct, it's learned behavior, passed down through families. Calvin thought about his own family traditions, the ways he and Sarah had tried to pass down values and perspectives to Ethan, the customs and habits that had died with her. He wondered what Scout might have learned from her pack before ending up alone on a highway, and what she would need to learn now to survive in a world that had suddenly become much more complicated. Coffee? Calvin offered, realizing he'd been staring at Rowena longer than was probably appropriate. I'd love some. Thanks. They moved into the kitchen, leaving Ethan in the garage with Scout. Through the window, Calvin could see his son settling into the lawn chair they'd placed near the enclosure. Notebook balanced on his knees as he continued his detailed observations of Scout's behavior. He's really taken to this, Rowena observed, following Calvin's gaze. It's the most interested he's been in anything since his mother died. Calvin poured coffee into 2 mugs, adding cream to his own. He barely spoke for months after the accident. Now he's keeping detailed notes on everything Scout does. Rowena accepted the mug Calvin offered her. Grief affects everyone differently. Sometimes having something else to focus on, something that needs you, can be part of the healing process. Calvin leaned against the kitchen counter, studying Rowena's profile as she watched Ethan through the window. There was something about her presence that made the house feel less empty, the silences less heavy. Not just because she filled them with conversation about wolf behavior and rehabilitation timelines, but because she seemed genuinely interested in the answers to the questions she asked about Calvin and Ethan's lives. What about you? Calvin asked. What got you interested in wildlife biology? Rowena turned from the window, and Calvin caught something briefly vulnerable in her expression before she covered it with a professional smile. The usual story, I suppose. Kid who loved animals more than people, turned that obsession into a career. More than people? Animals are honest, she said after a moment. They don't pretend to be something they're not, don't say things they don't mean. There's a purity in their motivations that I find comforting. Calvin had the sense there was more to the story, but Rowena's tone suggested the subject was closed. Instead, he asked, how long will you be staying in the area? Through the spring, probably. The research project is funded through June, and I want to see Scout's rehabilitation through to completion. She looked at him directly. If that's all right with you, of course. I know having a wildlife biologist appear in your garage every day wasn't exactly what you signed up for when you stopped to help an injured animal. Calvin realized he was smiling. Actually, it's been the best part of our days. Something flickered in Rowena's eyes, surprise, maybe, or pleasure. Mine too. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking coffee and watching Ethan sketch. Calvin found himself aware of small details he hadn't noticed in months. The way morning light came through the kitchen window, the sound of Ethan's pencil moving across paper, the faint scent of pine and outdoors that seemed to follow Rowena wherever she went. Calvin, Rowena said quietly, can I ask you something? Sure. When you found Scout on the highway, what made you stop? Most people would have driven past, especially in weather like that. Calvin considered the question. I don't know, exactly. Maybe because I know what it feels like to be broken and alone on the side of the road, waiting for someone to care enough to stop. Rowena nodded slowly. Sarah's death, among other things. Calvin found himself wanting to tell her about the months after he'd come home from overseas, the way he'd struggled to readjust to civilian life, the patience Sarah had shown while he figured out how to be a husband and father instead of a soldier, the way grief had made him feel like a stranger in his own life all over again. Well, Rowena said, I'm glad you stopped. For Scout's sake, obviously, but also for yours and Ethan's. Why? Because watching you two with her, seeing how much you care about her recovery, how invested you are in giving her the best possible chance at survival, it's reminded me why I do this work. Sometimes you need to see your own passion reflected in other people's faces to remember what it felt like when you first discovered it. Calvin looked at her carefully. Meaning you'd forgotten? Meaning I'd gotten so focused on the research, the data collection, the professional aspects of conservation work that I'd lost touch with the simple truth that every individual animal matters, not just as part of a population or an ecosystem, but as a unique being with its own right to live and thrive. She gestured toward the garage. Scout isn't just a data point in a Wolf reintroduction study. She's a specific individual whose life has value because she's herself, not because of what she represents. Calvin felt something shift in his understanding of both Rowena and the situation they'd all found themselves in. So we're helping each other. We're helping each other, she agreed. From the garage came the sound of Ethan talking quietly to Scout, his voice carrying the kind of gentle confidence Calvin hadn't heard since before Sarah's death. Through the window, Calvin could see his son leaning toward the enclosure, apparently explaining something to the Wolf pup, who was watching him with those bright amber eyes. They're helping each other too, Rowena observed. Calvin nodded, feeling something expand in his chest that he was afraid to name, but reluctant to let go of. For the first time in 18 months, the future felt like something other than an endless repetition of the same grief-heavy days. It felt like possibility. 3 weeks after Scout's arrival, Calvin found himself standing in the produce section of Pine Valley's only grocery store, holding a shopping list that included items he'd never purchased before: organic sweet potatoes, frozen venison, raw bones from the butcher counter, and something called probiotic powder that Rowena had explained was essential for maintaining proper digestive health and recovering. Wildlife. The transformation of his household routines had been gradual but comprehensive. His morning alarm now went off an hour earlier to accommodate Scout's feeding schedule. His garage had been reorganized around rehabilitation equipment and medical supplies. His evening plans increasingly revolved around Rowena's daily visits and the discussions of Scout's progress that seemed to expand naturally into conversations about everything else. Dad, they don't have the kind of bones Dr. Drowleth wanted, Ethan said, appearing at Calvin's elbow with a package from the meat counter. But Mr. Henderson said these beef bones would work just as well for dental health. Calvin examined the package, impressed by his son's growing expertise in wolf nutrition and care. Ethan had been devouring every book and article about wolves that Rowena brought him, and his notebook had evolved from simple sketches into detailed behavioral observations that Rowena said were genuinely useful for her research. Good thinking, Calvin said. Did you get the sweet potatoes? 2 pounds, like she said. And I found the probiotic powder in the pet supply section. Ethan hefted a small container. It's expensive, Calvin shrugged. Scout's worth it. As they loaded their purchases into the truck, Calvin reflected on how natural that statement had become. 3 weeks ago, he would have questioned the wisdom of spending significant money on specialized food for a wild animal that would eventually be released. Now, Scout's welfare had become as automatic a priority as any other household expense. The change wasn't just financial. Calvin's entire relationship with his property had shifted. He found himself viewing the land around his house through Rowena's eyes, noting which areas might provide appropriate exercise space as Scout's leg healed, identifying potential hazards that would need to be addressed. Before any outdoor rehabilitation could begin, he'd even started researching wolf behavior and conservation on his own, reading scientific papers that Rowena had mentioned and watching documentaries that helped him understand the complex social dynamics Scout would need to navigate when she was returned to the wild. Dr. Drelif's truck is already there, Ethan observed as they turned into their driveway. Calvin felt the small surge of anticipation that had become familiar over the past few weeks. Rowena's visits had evolved beyond simple medical check-ins into something that felt more like collaborative partnership. She consulted Calvin and Ethan on decisions about Scout's care, incorporated their observations into her professional assessments, and had begun staying for dinner more evenings than not. They found Rowena in the garage, kneeling beside Scout's enclosure with a collection of toys and enrichment items spread out on a blanket. Scout was investigating a puzzle feeder, a device designed to make wolves work for their food, simulating the problem-solving challenges they would face in the wild. "How's she doing with it?" Calvin asked, setting down the grocery bags. "Better than expected," Rowena replied without looking up. "She figured out the basic mechanism within about 10 minutes. Now she's experimenting with different approaches to see which one is most efficient." Calvin watched Scout manipulate the feeder with her paws and teeth, her movements showing increasing confidence despite the cast that still protected her healing leg. The transformation over the past 3 weeks had been remarkable, not just physically, but in terms of alertness, curiosity, and engagement with her environment. "I brought the bones you wanted," Ethan said, showing Rowena the package. "And I have some new observations from yesterday." Rowena smiled. "Let's hear them." Ethan flipped open his notebook, his voice taking on the serious tone he used when discussing Scout's behavior. "She's been spending more time at the elevated sleeping area, especially during the afternoon. And she started burying leftover food in the far corner of the enclosure, even though she knows we'll feed her again the same evening." "Excellent observations," Rowena said. "Both of those behaviors suggest her natural instincts are developing appropriately. The elevated resting and food catching are classic wolf behaviors that indicate she's thinking beyond immediate needs." Calvin felt pride in his son's growing expertise, but also something deeper, a recognition of how much Ethan had changed since Scout's arrival. The withdrawn, tablet-obsessed boy who had barely spoken for months had been replaced by someone engaged with the physical world, curious about animal behavior, confident enough to contribute meaningfully to adult conversations about complex scientific topics. "I've been thinking about the next phase of rehabilitation," Rowena said, standing and brushing off her knees. "The cast should come off next week, and once we confirm the leg has healed properly, we'll need to start expanding Scout's environment." "Meaning?" Calvin asked. "Meaning she needs space to run, opportunities to practice hunting behaviors, exposure to the kinds of environmental challenges she faces in the wild." Rowena gestured toward the garage doors. "This enclosure has served its purpose, but she's ready for something larger." Calvin had been expecting this conversation, but he still felt something like reluctance. Scout's presence in his garage had become a comforting constant, a reason to get up early and stay engaged with the world beyond his own grief. The idea of moving her further away felt like losing something important. "How much larger?" Ethan asked. "Ideally several acres. Enough space for her to develop proper exercise patterns, practice stalking and chasing behaviors, learn to navigate different types of terrain." Rowena looked at Calvin. "I've been scouting potential sites on state land, but they're all pretty far from here. The logistics of daily monitoring and feeding would be challenging." Calvin found himself saying, "What about here?" Rowena raised an eyebrow. "Here? I've got 12 acres behind the house. Most of it's just woods and meadow that I don't use for anything. If we fenced the right section, would that work?" Calvin, that would be a significant investment. Professional wildlife fencing, proper gates, environmental modifications. Rowena looked concerned. And once Scout is released, you'd be left with an expensive setup that wouldn't have any other purpose. Calvin looked at Ethan, who was watching the conversation with obvious hope. "What do you think?" he asked his son. "I think Scout belongs here," Ethan said simply. "Not forever, but for as long as she needs to learn how to be wild again." Calvin turned back to Rowena. "How much are we talking about?" Over the next hour, Rowena walked Calvin and Ethan through the property, pointing out areas that would work well for different aspects of Scout's rehabilitation. A section of dense forest where she could practice stalking skills. A meadow that could support the small game animals she would need to learn to hunt. A stream that would provide both water and the kind of environmental complexity that wild wolves encountered daily. It would actually be ideal, Rowena admitted as they stood at the edge of the woods, looking back toward the house. Close enough for daily monitoring, large enough for meaningful exercise, diverse enough to provide appropriate challenges. And afterwards? Calvin asked. After Scout is released? Rowena was quiet for a moment. Well, the infrastructure could be used for other wildlife rehabilitation. There's always a need for temporary housing for injured or orphaned animals. And if you were interested, the State Parks Department has grant programs that help fund private rehabilitation facilities. Calvin felt something click into place, a sense of purpose that extended beyond Scout's individual needs. You mean this could become permanent? A real wildlife rehabilitation center? It could. With the right permits and partnerships. Rowena looked at him carefully. But that's a big commitment, Calvin. It would change your life in ways you might not have considered. Calvin looked at his property through new eyes, imagining it as a place where injured animals could heal and learn to be wild again, where Ethan could continue developing his growing passion for wildlife biology, where he himself might find a way to channel his own healing into something that helped others. Maybe. My life needs changing, he said, that evening. After Rowena had left and Scout was settled for the night, Calvin and Ethan sat on the back porch with mugs of hot chocolate, watching the sun set behind the tree line that might soon become Scout's outdoor rehabilitation space. Are you really going to do it? Ethan asked. The fencing and everything? Calvin considered the question. 3 weeks ago, his biggest decision had been whether to drive around an injured animal or stop to help. Now he was contemplating a commitment that would reshape his property, his finances, and his future in ways he was only beginning to understand. But he was also considering the possibility of a life that included Rowena's daily presence, Ethan's growing confidence and engagement, and a purpose that extended beyond their own family's healing. I think so, Calvin said. What do you think about that? Ethan was quiet for several minutes, staring out at the woods. Finally he said, I think Mom would have liked Dr. Dralath. Calvin felt something tight in his chest loosen. Yeah? She would have liked how she talks to Scout, how she listens when I tell her stuff, how she makes you smile again. Ethan looked at his father. And she would have wanted us to help Scout learn how to be wild. Calvin reached over and squeezed his son's shoulder. I think you're right. That night, Calvin lay awake thinking about fencing costs and permit applications, about the logistics of building something permanent from what had started as a temporary emergency. But mostly he thought about the way Rowena's eyes lit up when she talked about Scout's progress, the way Ethan had started sleeping better since Scout's arrival, the way the house felt less like a memorial to loss and more like a home where healing was possible. For the first time since Sarah's death, Calvin was planning for a future that felt worth building. The X-rays showed perfect bone alignment, clean healing, and no complications. Dr. Hensley pronounces Scout's leg fully recovered, and the cast came off on a Thursday morning in early November, revealing a limb that was slightly thinner than its counterpart, but otherwise strong and functional. Scout's first steps without the cast were tentative. careful testing of weight distribution and balance. But within an hour, she was moving with increasing confidence around her enclosure, and by evening she was demonstrating the kind of fluid, purposeful movement that indicated her rehabilitation was progressing exactly as it should. She's ready for the outdoor space, Rowena confirmed, watching Scout pace the perimeter of the garage enclosure with obvious restlessness. How's the fencing project coming? Calvin wiped his hands on a rag, gesturing toward the window where workers could be seen installing the final sections of 8-foot wildlife fencing around what would become Scout's 3-acre rehabilitation area. Should be finished by tomorrow afternoon. The gate hardware arrives Monday. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind of construction activity, permit applications, and equipment deliveries. Calvin had invested more money in the project than he'd initially planned, but watching Scout's growing need for space and exercise had convinced him that anything less than professional-grade facilities would be inadequate. He'd also discovered, somewhat to his surprise, that he enjoyed the planning and construction aspects of creating something purposeful and lasting. The rehabilitation area wasn't just fencing. It included shelter structures for weather protection, elevated observation platforms for behavioral monitoring, and even a small stream diversion that would provide flowing water throughout the enclosed space. It looks incredible, Rowena said, though Calvin caught something in her tone that suggested the conversation wasn't finished. But? He prompted. Rowena was quiet for a moment, watching Scout investigate a new enrichment toy. Calvin, we need to talk about timeline. Scout's progress has been faster than I expected, which is wonderful. But it also means we're getting closer to the point where she'll need to be evaluated for release candidacy. Calvin felt something cold settle in his stomach. How much closer? If she adapts well to the outdoor space, demonstrates appropriate hunting behaviors, and continues to maintain healthy wariness around humans, she could potentially be ready for soft release by early spring. Maybe sooner. Ethan looked up from his notebook. But that's good, right? That's what we've been working toward. It is, Rowena agreed. It's exactly what we've been working toward. I just want to make sure everyone understands what that means. Calvin understood what she wasn't saying directly. Scout's departure would end the daily routine that had given structure and purpose to their lives for the past month. It would eliminate the reason for Rowena's regular visits, the shared project that had brought them all together, the common focus that had helped Ethan emerge from his grief and helped Calvin imagine a future beyond survival. And after that? Calvin asked. After Scout is released? Rowena was quiet for several minutes, her attention apparently focused on Scout's behavior, but Calvin could sense deeper currents in her silence. Finally, she said, "That depends on a lot of things." Like what? Like whether the State Parks Department approves your application for the rehabilitation facility permits. Like whether you really want to commit to the kind of long-term wildlife work that would justify maintaining this setup. She looked at him directly. Like whether you're doing this because you genuinely want to help wildlife, or because it's a way to avoid dealing with other aspects of your life. Calvin felt something defensive rise in his chest. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Rowena said gently, that sometimes people throw themselves into projects like this as a way of avoiding harder conversations. About grief, about moving forward, about what they actually want their lives to look like, Ethan had gone very still, his attention shifting between his father and Rowena with the hyper-alert awareness of someone who had learned to read adult tensions as potential threats to stability. Calvin took a deep breath, recognizing that this conversation had been building for weeks. You think I'm using Scout as a distraction. I think you're using Scout as a way to avoid thinking about what happens when she's gone. To your relationship with Ethan, to your healing process, to the possibility that you might want things for yourself that aren't just about being a father or taking care of injured animals. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Calvin found himself aware of how much had changed since that stormy night when he'd found Scout on the highway, not just in terms of their daily routines, but in the fundamental assumptions about what his life could include. What if I don't know what I want? Calvin asked quietly. Then maybe it's time to figure it out. Rowena's voice was gentle, but Calvin could hear something else underneath: vulnerability, maybe, or uncertainty. He realized that whatever was happening between them had become as complicated for her as it had for him. Can I ask you something? Calvin said. Sure. When you said animals are honest, that they don't pretend to be something they're not, what were you really talking about? Rowena looked away, and Calvin saw her hands tighten slightly around the notebook she was holding. I was talking about people who say they want one thing when they really want something else. People who make promises they don't keep, commitments they don't honor. Someone specific? My ex-husband. The words came out flat, matter of fact. We were both wildlife biologists, supposed to be partners in research and in life. Turned out he was better at the research part. Calvin waited, sensing there was more. He had very specific ideas about what our life should look like. House in the suburbs, stable teaching positions, weekend hobbies that didn't interfere with career advancement. Rowena's voice carried a bitterness Calvin hadn't heard before. When I got the opportunity to do field research, to actually work with wild wolf populations instead of just writing papers about them, he considered it a betrayal of our shared goals. So you chose the wolves. I chose authenticity over convenience. And he chose someone whose ambitions were more compatible with his own. Rowena looked at Calvin directly. The divorce was finalized 6 months ago. This research project is supposed to be a fresh start. Calvin began to understand why Rowena's presence in their lives felt both natural and precarious. She was dealing with her own process of rebuilding, her own questions about what came next, her own uncertainty about whether temporary arrangements could become something more permanent. And now? Calvin asked. Now I'm trying to figure out whether I can trust my own judgment about people. Whether I'm capable of recognizing the difference between someone who says they want to build something together and someone who actually means it. The admission settled between them like a bridge, an acknowledgement of the deeper currents that had been running beneath their conversations about Scout's rehabilitation and the future of the wildlife facility. Ethan, who had been listening with the focused attention of someone trying to understand adult complexity, said quietly, Dr. Dralith, do you want to stay here after Scout gets released? Rowena looked at Ethan, then at Calvin. I want to stay where I can do meaningful work with people who actually care about the outcomes. I want to stay where honesty feels possible. Calvin found himself stepping closer to her, aware that they were approaching some kind of turning point that would affect all of their futures. What if we want you to stay? Not just for the wildlife work, but for all of it? All of it? The daily conversations about things that matter. The shared meals and planning sessions. The way you make Ethan laugh and the way you challenge my assumptions about what I'm capable of building. Calvin paused. The way you make this house feel like home again, instead of just a place where we're surviving. Rowena's eyes were bright, and Calvin could see her working through the implications of what he was suggesting. Calvin, that's a big step. For all of us. I know. And if it doesn't work? If we try to build something together and discover we're not as compatible as we think we are? Calvin looked at Scout, who was watching their conversation with the kind of alert intelligence that suggested she understood the emotional stakes even if she couldn't parse the words. Then he looked at Ethan, whose notebook was forgotten in his lap, as he waited to hear how the adults would navigate this crucial decision. Then, we'll deal with that when it happens, Calvin said. But I'd rather try and fail than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been possible. Rowena was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, the permits for the rehabilitation facility, they'll require a minimum 5-year commitment. Professional oversight, regular inspections, detailed record keeping. 5 years. Calvin repeated. 5 years, she confirmed. Minimum. Calvin looked at her carefully. Are you saying you'd be willing to provide the professional oversight? I'm saying I'd be willing to stay and find out what we could build together. All of us, she gestured toward Scout, starting with giving her the best possible chance at a wild life, and then seeing what comes next. Ethan closed his notebook and stood up. I think Mom would want us to try. Calvin felt something settle in his chest, not the heavy weight of grief that had been his constant companion for 18 months, but something lighter, more forward-looking. Something that felt like hope. Then let's try, he said, that evening. As Rowena stayed for dinner and she and Ethan discussed plans for Scout's transition to the outdoor rehabilitation space, Calvin found himself imagining a future that included all of them. Not as a replacement for what he'd lost with Sarah, but as something new, a family constellation that honored the past while building toward possibilities he'd never considered before. Scout would return to the wild in the spring, but the infrastructure they were building would remain. Other injured animals would need care and rehabilitation. Ethan's passion for wildlife biology would continue to grow, and Rowena's presence would transform their temporary arrangement into something permanent and purposeful. For the first time since Sarah's death, Calvin was planning not just for survival, but for the kind of life worth living. Scout's first morning in the outdoor rehabilitation space was a revelation. Calvin stood at the observation platform he'd built along the eastern fence line, watching through binoculars as the wolf explored her new environment with an enthusiasm that bordered on euphoria. The 3-acre enclosure included dense forest, open meadow, and the diverted stream that wound through both terrains, providing the kind of environmental complexity that would prepare her for eventual release. She's already found the den site, Rowena said, joining Calvin on the platform with her own field glasses and a thermos of coffee. Look, near the large oak at the forest edge. Calvin adjusted his focus and saw Scout investigating a natural depression beneath the tree's root system, her movements purposeful and investigative. She was using her nose to examine every inch of the space, occasionally pawing at the earth or testing the stability of overhead branches. Is that normal behavior? Calvin asked. Completely normal. Wolves are den-oriented animals. They need secure resting places that provide protection and territorial advantage. Rowena lowered her binoculars. The fact that she's immediately seeking appropriate shelter means her instincts are intact. Ethan appeared on the platform carrying his notebook and a digital camera that Rowena had taught him to use for behavioral documentation. Over the past month, his observations had become sophisticated enough that Rowena incorporated them into her official research reports. She's been following the stream for 20 minutes, Ethan reported, and she found the rabbit warren near the meadow edge. She spent a long time watching it. Calvin felt a surge of pride in his son's growing expertise, but also something deeper, a recognition of how much Ethan had changed since Scout's arrival. The boy who had once spent entire days absorbed in electronic devices was now awake before dawn, eager to observe and document the natural world with an intensity that reminded Calvin of Sarah's focused passion for her own work. Any hunting behavior? Rowena asked. She practiced stalking a squirrel, but it was more like play than serious hunting. And she's been investigating scent marks along the fence line. Rowena nodded approvingly. She's mapping her territory, understanding boundaries and resources. All positive indicators. They spent the morning documenting Scout's exploration patterns, taking notes on her preferences for different terrain types, her attention to potential prey animals, and her reaction to various environmental stimuli. By afternoon, Scout had established what appeared to be regular patrol routes through her enclosure, marking key locations with scent and returning periodically to her chosen den site. This is going better than I hoped, Rowena admitted as they took a break for lunch. Her adaptation to outdoor space has been immediate and confident. If she continues progressing at this rate, we could start introducing live prey within a few weeks. Calvin looked up from his sandwich. Live prey? Live prey? Mice and rabbits, primarily. She needs to practice actual hunting skills, not just stalking and chasing. It's the difference between play behavior and survival behavior. Ethan was sketching Scout's den site in his notebook, his pencil moving with practiced precision. Will she know how to hunt? Or do we have to teach her? Wolves have innate hunting instincts, but they refine their techniques through practice and observation of other pack members, Rowena explained. Since Scout doesn't have a pack to learn from, she needs to develop her skills through trial and error. Our job is to provide appropriate opportunities. That afternoon brought an unexpected development. Scout had been resting in her den when she suddenly emerged, alert and focused on something beyond the enclosure's boundaries. Her posture was different from her usual exploratory behavior, ears forward, body tense, attention fixed on a specific point in the forest beyond the fence. Calvin followed her gaze, but saw nothing unusual. What's she looking at? Rowena was already moving toward the fence, her expression shifting to professional intensity. I'm not sure, but her body language suggests she's detected something significant. They walked the perimeter of the enclosure, trying to identify what had captured Scout's attention. It was Ethan who spotted the track's first large paw prints in the mud near the stream, outside the fence but close enough to the enclosure that Scout would have caught the scent. Wolf tracks, Rowena confirmed, kneeling to examine the prints more closely. Adult, probably male based on the size. Fresh made within the last few hours, Calvin felt something cold settle in his stomach. Wild wolves? Here? It's possible. The reintroduction program in this region has been more successful than we initially projected. There are at least 3 established packs within 50 miles of here. Rowena stood, brushing mud from her knees. This could actually be positive news for Scout's eventual release. How is that positive? Because it means there are established territories she could potentially join. The biggest challenge in wolf rehabilitation is finding appropriate release sites with existing pack structures that might accept a new member. Calvin looked at Scout, who continued to pace along the fence line nearest to where the tracks had been found. Her behavior had shifted from casual exploration to something more focused and purposeful, the kind of alertness that suggested she understood the significance of what she was detecting. What happens if wild wolves try to approach the enclosure? Ethan asked. Depends on their intentions. They might simply be investigating the scent of another wolf in their territory. Or they might be assessing Scout as a potential pack member. Rowena paused. Or they might view her as competition for resources. That evening, Calvin found himself checking the perimeter fence with unusual attention to detail, examining gate latches and testing the stability of fence posts. The discovery of wild wolf tracks had introduced a new variable into Scout's rehabilitation, one that could either accelerate her eventual release or complicate it in ways they hadn't anticipated. You're worried, Rowena observed, joining him near the main gate. I'm responsible for her safety while she's here. The idea of wild wolves trying to get into the enclosure, or Scout trying to get out to reach them, makes me nervous. It should make you proud, Rowena said. Scout's response to detecting other wolves means her social instincts are developing appropriately. She recognizes her own species, understands pack dynamics, feels the pull of wild community. Calvin looked through the fence at Scout, who had settled into her den but remained visibly alert, ears twitching at every sound from the surrounding forest. It means she's remembering what she was meant to be. Exactly. And that's the entire point of rehabilitation, not just physical healing, but psychological and social preparation for a wild life. Over the following days, Scout's behavior continued to evolve in response to the knowledge that other wolves inhabited the area. She spent increasing amounts of time patrolling the fence line, her movements more purposeful and confident. Her hunting practice became more serious and sustained, suggesting an understanding that survival skills would soon be necessary. Most significantly, she began howling. The first howl came at dusk on Thursday, a long, melodic call that carried across the valley with haunting clarity. Calvin and Ethan rushed to the observation platform, where they found Scout standing on a small rise near the center of her enclosure, head tilted back, voice lifted in the kind of communication that had been missing from her behavioral repertoire until now. "She's announcing her presence," Rowena explained, arriving with recording equipment to document the vocalization, letting any nearby wolves know that this territory is occupied. "Will they answer?" Ethan asked Dot as if in response to his question. An answering howl drifted across the valley from the direction of the ridge, deeper, more mature, clearly from an adult wolf. Scout's ears pricked forward, and she howled again, her voice stronger and more confident. "They're communicating," Rowena said, her voice filled with professional excitement and personal satisfaction. "Scout is engaging in appropriate pack communication behaviors with wild wolves." Calvin listened to the exchange of calls, Scout's high, clear voice, and the deeper responses from the forest, and felt something profound shift in his understanding of what they were accomplishing. They weren't just healing an injured animal. They were preparing a member of an ancient community to return to her rightful place in a social structure that had existed for thousands of years. That night, as Scout's howls continued to echo across the valley, Calvin sat on his back porch with Rowena and Ethan, listening to a conversation between wild and rehabilitated, between isolation and belonging, between what had been lost and what might be reclaimed. "She's ready, isn't she?" Calvin asked quietly. Rowena nodded. "She's remembering who she was meant to be," and in that moment, Calvin realized that Scout's journey toward wildness was teaching him something essential about his own journey toward whatever came next. That healing wasn't about returning to what had been, but about discovering what was possible. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, bearing the official seal of the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Department, and an address that made Calvin's stomach tighten before he'd even opened the envelope. Ethan was at school, and Rowena was conducting her regular behavioral assessment with Scout, which meant Calvin had to absorb the letter's contents alone. The language was bureaucratic and polite, but the message was clear. The department had received complaints about unauthorized wildlife rehabilitation activities on private property, and an investigation would be conducted to ensure compliance with state regulations governing the care and housing of protected species. Calvin read the letter 3 times, trying to understand the implications. He'd been careful to follow Rowena's guidance about permits and documentation, but the rehabilitation facility was still in the approval process. Scout's presence on his property existed in a legal gray area that had seemed manageable when it was temporary emergency care, but looked increasingly problematic as their commitment deepened and expanded. "Calvin?" Rowena's voice carried from the direction of Scout's enclosure. "Can you come look at this?" Calvin folded the letter and walked toward the rehabilitation area, where he found Rowena standing near the fence with an expression of concern that had nothing to do with Scout's progress. "What's wrong?" Calvin asked. Rowena pointed toward the forest beyond the enclosure, where Calvin could see a man in khaki uniform moving through the trees with the methodical precision of someone conducting an official survey. "State Parks investigator. He's been photographing the facility for the past hour." Calvin felt something cold settle deeper in his chest. "Did he identify himself?" "Showed me his credentials when I approached the fence. Said he was conducting a routine assessment of reported wildlife activity." Rowena's voice carried professional calm, but Calvin could hear underlying tension. "He's been asking detailed questions about Scout's presence here, the duration of her stay, and the nature of her injuries." Calvin pulled out the letter and handed it to Rowena, watching her expression shift as she read. "This is about the neighbors," she said after finishing the letter. "What do you mean?" "I've seen vehicles parked along the road recently, people with cameras and binoculars watching the property. Some of them have been here multiple times." Rowena gestured toward the direction of the main road. "Scout's howling has attracted attention. People know there's a wolf here. Calvin felt anger rising alongside his anxiety. Scout's vocalizations with the wild pack had become a nightly occurrence, filling the valley with the kind of wild music that connected the landscape to its deeper history. The idea that neighbors would view this as a problem worth reporting to state authorities felt like a betrayal of something sacred. "So what happens now?" Calvin asked. "The investigator will compile a report about whether Scout's presence here constitutes a violation of wildlife protection statutes. If they determine that we're operating an unlicensed rehabilitation facility, they could order her immediate removal to a state-approved facility. Calvin looked through the fence at Scout, who was investigating something near her den site, apparently oblivious to the fact that her future was being debated by people who had never witnessed her journey from near death to vibrant wildness. And if they remove her, she'd probably be transferred to a facility near Denver, where she'd complete her rehabilitation under different protocols. Different people, different environment, different timeline for release. Rowena's voice was carefully neutral, but Calvin understood what she wasn't saying directly. Scout's rehabilitation had been successful precisely because of the personalized attention, familiar caregivers, and gradual adaptation to a specific environment. Transferring her to an institutional facility would disrupt psychological bonds and environmental adaptations that had taken months to develop. "How long do we have?" The investigator said he'd submit his report within a week. The department would make their decision based on that assessment and any public comment they receive. Calvin found himself thinking about the months of careful progress, the daily observations and behavioral modifications, the growing confidence in Scout's eyes as she'd remembered how to be wild. The idea of losing her to bureaucratic processes felt like losing Sarah all over again, sudden, arbitrary, devastating in its finality. That evening, Calvin sat at his kitchen table with a stack of legal documents, permit applications, and correspondence with various state agencies, trying to understand what options might exist for keeping Scout in their care until her release. The paperwork was complex and contradictory, filled with regulations that seemed designed to discourage private wildlife rehabilitation rather than support it. Ethan arrived home from school to find his father surrounded by official papers, and his expression immediately shifted to the kind of alert wariness that suggested he recognized the signs of adult crisis. "Is something wrong with Scout?" Ethan asked. Calvin explained about the investigation and the possibility that Scout might be transferred to a different facility. Ethan listened with the focused attention of someone processing information that could fundamentally alter his understanding of the future. "But she belongs here," Ethan said when Calvin finished. "She knows this place. She knows us. And the wild wolves, they're starting to accept her." "I know. So we fight it, right? We prove that she's better off here than anywhere else?" Calvin looked at his son's determined expression, recognizing something of Sarah's fierce protectiveness in Ethan's response to the threat. "How do you think we should do that?" Ethan was quiet for several minutes, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally he said, "We document everything. Every behavior, every improvement, every sign that she's ready for release. We prove that what we're doing here is working better than what they could do somewhere else." That night, Calvin called Rowena to discuss strategy. She arrived within an hour, carrying a laptop and a folder thick with research papers and professional documentation. "Ethan's right about documenting everything," she said, settling at the kitchen table with her materials. "But we need to do more than just prove Scout's progress. We need to demonstrate that this facility meets or exceeds professional standards for wildlife rehabilitation." "How do we do that?" "We accelerate the permit process, demonstrate compliance with all relevant regulations, and provide evidence that Scout's rehabilitation here has achieved outcomes that justify the arrangement." Rowena opened her laptop. "I've been tracking data on Scout's progress, physical recovery, behavioral development, social responsiveness. Her metrics are better than typical rehabilitation facilities." Calvin felt something like hope beginning to compete with his anxiety. Better how? Faster healing, more natural behavior patterns, stronger social instincts, better preparation for wild release. The individualized attention and specialized environment have produced results that would be difficult to replicate in a larger, institutional setting. They spent the next several hours preparing documentation that would support keeping Scout in their care, medical records, behavioral assessments, environmental evaluations, and professional recommendations. By midnight, they had assembled a comprehensive case for the value of their rehabilitation approach. "There's one more thing we should consider," Rowena said as she prepared to leave. "What's that?" "The wild pack that's been communicating with Scout. If they're genuinely accepting her as a potential member, that could accelerate her release timeline. We might be able to argue for immediate soft release rather than additional facility rehabilitation." Calvin felt something shift in his understanding of their options. "You mean release her now? Before the state makes their decision?" "I mean we present the state with evidence that Scout is ready for release. That continued captivity would actually harm her chances of successful wild integration, and that immediate soft release represents the best possible outcome for her individual welfare." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. Scout's release had always been the goal, but Calvin had imagined it happening in spring, after months of additional preparation. The possibility of immediate release felt like losing her suddenly, but also like achieving the ultimate success of their rehabilitation efforts. "How do we prove she's ready?" "We document her pack communication, her hunting success, her territorial behaviors. We demonstrate that she's achieved the psychological and physical markers of wild readiness." Rowena looked at Calvin. "Seriously? And we accept that sometimes the right thing to do happens faster than we're emotionally prepared for." That night, Calvin lay awake thinking about timelines and bureaucratic processes, about the difference between what Scout needed and what he wanted, about the possibility that loving something sometimes meant letting it go sooner than you'd planned. Outside, Scout's voice lifted in a howl that was answered immediately by the wild pack, their conversation carrying across the valley like a promise of belonging that transcended human plans and preferences. The meeting was scheduled for Friday morning at the Pine Valley Community Center, and Calvin arrived to find the room more crowded than he'd expected. State Parks officials occupied a table at the front, flanked by representatives from wildlife advocacy groups and what appeared to be several neighbors who had lodged the original complaints. Rowena sat beside Calvin, a carefully organized folder of documentation in front of her, while Ethan had positioned himself in the back row with his notebook and camera ready to document whatever transpired. The state investigator, a thin man named Morrison, who had spent the previous week photographing and measuring every aspect of Scout's rehabilitation facility, stood at a podium reviewing his notes. "This hearing will determine the appropriate disposition of a North American gray wolf currently being housed on private property under circumstances that may or may not comply with state wildlife protection statutes," Morrison announced. "We'll hear from all relevant parties before making our recommendation." Calvin listened as Morrison presented his findings, a detailed assessment of the rehabilitation facility that was surprisingly thorough and, to Calvin's relief, generally positive. The investigator acknowledged that Scout's care had been appropriate and professional, that her physical recovery was complete, and that her behavioral development appeared consistent with successful rehabilitation. However, Morrison continued, the facility operates without proper permits, and the extended timeline for rehabilitation raises questions about whether continued captivity serves the animal's best interests. Mrs. Hendricks, Calvin's nearest neighbor, spoke next, expressing concerns about property values, safety risks, and the appropriateness of keeping dangerous wild animals in residential areas. Her presentation was brief but pointed, emphasizing the community's right to be consulted about activities that could affect their welfare and property values. Calvin felt anger rise in his chest as Mrs. Hendricks described, "Scout is a threat to local pets and livestock. But Rowena's hand on his arm reminded him to stay focused on their strategic objectives, rather than emotional responses, when called to present their case. Rowena stood with the calm professionalism that had characterized all of her work with Scout. She methodically reviewed Scout's medical recovery, behavioral progress, and current readiness indicators, using charts and photographs to document improvements that would have been impossible without individualized care. Scout's rehabilitation has exceeded typical timelines and outcomes, Rowena concluded, precisely because she's received specialized attention in an environment designed specifically for her needs. Transferring her to an institutional facility at this point would disrupt adaptations that have taken months to develop. Morrison nodded approvingly at several points during Rowena's presentation, but his expression remained carefully neutral. When she finished, he asked, "Dr. Drowleth, in your professional opinion, what timeline would you recommend for Scout's release?" Rowena looked at Calvin, then back at Morrison. Based on her current behavioral markers and recent PAC communication activities, Scout appears ready for immediate soft release evaluation. Calvin felt something cold settle in his stomach. They had discussed this possibility, but hearing Rowena stated as a professional recommendation made it suddenly real in ways he wasn't prepared for. Immediate release? Morrison asked. Soft release with monitoring and support. Scout has demonstrated all the behavioral markers we look for in release candidates: appropriate wariness of humans, successful hunting practice, strong territorial instincts, and most importantly, active communication with an established wild pack. Morrison made notes as Rowena continued explaining the technical aspects of soft release protocols, but Calvin found himself struggling to focus on the details. The idea that Scout might be released within days rather than months felt like emotional whiplash, the successful culmination of everything they'd worked toward, but also the sudden loss of the daily purpose that had given structure and meaning to their lives. When Morrison called Calvin to speak, he stood slowly, uncertain what he wanted to say until he looked back at Ethan, whose expression combined hope and anxiety in equal measure. 6 weeks ago, I found an injured wolf pup on Highway 47, Calvin began. I could have driven past, called someone else to handle it, treated it as somebody else's responsibility. Instead, I stopped, and that decision changed everything. Calvin looked around the room, making eye contact with Morrison, Mrs. Hendricks, and the various officials who would determine Scout's fate. Scout's recovery hasn't just been about healing a broken leg or teaching her to hunt. It's been about remembering what it means to care about something beyond your own immediate needs, to commit to outcomes that matter more than convenience. Calvin paused. My son has learned more about biology, ecology, and responsibility in the past 6 weeks than he did in the previous year of school. I've remembered what it feels like to build something meaningful instead of just getting through each day. Calvin gestured toward the window, beyond which Scout's rehabilitation area was visible. But this was never about what Scout could do for us. It was about what we could do for her. And if Dr. Drowleth says she's ready for release, then our job is to support that transition, regardless of what it means for our own preferences. Morrison was taking notes throughout Calvin's statement, his expression suggesting that the human dimensions of Scout's rehabilitation were as relevant to his assessment as the technical wildlife management considerations. When all presentations were complete, Morrison called a brief recess while the state officials deliberated. Calvin stepped outside with Rowena and Ethan, where they could see Scout in her enclosure, apparently unaware that her future was being decided by a room full of people she'd never met. "You said immediate soft release," Calvin said to Rowena. "How immediate?" "If they approve our recommendations, we could begin the process next week. Initial release into a larger, temporary enclosure on state land, with monitoring and supplemental feeding as needed. If Scout demonstrates successful adaptation, full release within 2 to 3 weeks." Ethan was watching Scout through the fence. "Will we be able to visit her after she's released?" "Probably not," Rowena said gently. The goal is complete independence from human contact. Continued association with us could interfere with her integration into wild pack dynamics. Calvin realized they were approaching the fundamental challenge of all. Rehabilitation work success meant saying goodbye. The better they had done their job, the more completely Scout would need to leave their lives and join the wild community she was meant for. When they returned to the community center, Morrison was ready with the state's decision. Based on our assessment of the rehabilitation facility, the professional qualifications of the supervising biologist, and the documented progress of the animal in question, the state finds that Scout's care has met appropriate standards for wildlife rehabilitation. Morrison paused, looking directly at Calvin. Furthermore, we agree with Dr. Drylith's assessment that continued captivity would not serve Scout's best interests. Calvin felt relief and loss simultaneously. Therefore, Morrison continued, we're authorizing immediate soft release protocols to be supervised by Dr. Drylith and conducted on state wildlife management land. The release process will begin Monday morning. As people began filing out of the community center, Calvin found himself standing in the parking lot with Rowena and Ethan, trying to process the reality that Scout would be leaving their care within days. Monday, Ethan said quietly. Monday, Rowena confirmed. Calvin looked at his son, then at Rowena, then back toward his property where Scout was spending her final weekend in the rehabilitation facility they had built together. So what happens to us? Calvin asked. After Monday? Rowena's smile was warm but uncertain. I guess we find out what we built together when we weren't focused on building it. That evening, Calvin stood at the observation platform, watching Scout pace the familiar perimeter of her enclosure, her movements confident and purposeful. In 3 days, she would begin the final phase of her journey back to wildness. And Calvin would begin the next phase of his own journey toward whatever came after, healing. The soft release site was located on state wildlife management land 15 miles northeast of Calvin's property, in a valley where the established wolf pack had been tracked for the past 2 years. Rowena had selected the location carefully close enough to known pack territory for potential integration, but isolated enough to allow Scout privacy during her transition to complete independence. Calvin and Ethan arrived at dawn on Monday morning to find Rowena already setting up monitoring equipment around a large, temporary enclosure that would serve as Scout's final stepping stone between captivity and freedom. The structure was designed to be opened remotely, allowing Scout to choose her own timing for venturing into the wider landscape. How long will she stay in there? Ethan asked, watching Rowena adjust motion-activated cameras that would document Scout's behavior without requiring human presence. That depends entirely on her comfort level, Rowena replied. Some animals leave within hours. Others take weeks to work up the courage. We let Scout decide what feels right. The transport from Calvin's property to the release site had gone smoothly, with Scout showing alertness rather than distress at the change in environment. Now as she explored her temporary enclosure, her movements suggested curiosity about the new scents and sounds of wild territory rather than anxiety about unfamiliar surroundings. Calvin watched Scout investigate the boundaries of her space, noting how different her behavior appeared from those first days in his garage. The injured, barely conscious animal they had rescued had transformed into something magnificent, alert, confident, powerful in ways that spoke to thousands of years of evolutionary adaptation. She knows, doesn't she? Calvin said quietly. She understands what's happening, Rowena nodded. Wolves are incredibly intelligent about territorial changes. She can smell the pack, hear their communications, sense that she's in their range. Her body language suggests excitement rather than fear. As if to confirm Rowena's assessment, Scout moved to the highest point in her enclosure and released a long, clear howl that carried across the valley. The response came almost immediately, multiple voices from different directions, creating a complex harmony that spoke of pack structure and social dynamics. "They're talking to her," Ethan observed, his voice filled with wonder. "They're evaluating her," Rowena corrected gently, "trying to determine whether she's a potential pack member or territorial competition. Her responses over the next few days will determine how they proceed." Calvin found himself thinking about his own evaluation process over the past months, the way he'd gradually moved from survival mode to active engagement, from grief-focused isolation to purposeful connection with Rowena and deeper relationship with Ethan. Scout's transition to wildness paralleled his own transition toward whatever came next. Over the following week, Calvin and Ethan made daily trips to the release site, maintaining a respectful distance while documenting Scout's progress through Rowena's monitoring equipment. Scout had left her temporary enclosure on the third day, establishing a den site within a quarter-mile of the pack's known territory. Her hunting success exceeded expectations. Trail cameras captured her stalking and successfully taking small prey with the kind of efficiency that indicated her rehabilitation had prepared her well for wild survival. More importantly, the cameras documented increasing interactions with pack members, beginning with cautious observation and progressing to what appeared to be preliminary acceptance. "Behaviors. She's integrating faster than I hoped," Rowena reported during their Friday check-in. "The pack alpha female has been observed sharing a kill with Scout, which suggests they're accepting her as a subordinate pack member rather than viewing her as competition." Calvin felt pride mixed with a profound sense of completion. Scout's successful integration represented the ultimate validation of everything they had built together, not just the rehabilitation facility, but the collaborative relationship that had made her recovery possible. "So what happens now?" Ethan asked. "Do we keep monitoring her?" "For another few weeks to ensure the integration remains stable. After that, Scout becomes just another member of the wild pack, no longer dependent on human support or intervention. That evening, as they prepared to leave the monitoring site for what might be their final visit, Calvin found himself reflecting on the changes that Scout's presence had brought to their lives. The shy, withdrawn boy who had barely spoken for months after Sarah's death had become someone confident enough to contribute meaningfully to wildlife research. The grief-stricken widower who had struggled to imagine any future beyond survival had discovered purposes and relationships he hadn't known were possible. "Dad," Ethan said as they packed up their equipment, "what are we going to do with the rehabilitation space at home?" Calvin looked at Rowena, who had been unusually quiet during the day's observations. "I think that depends on whether Dr. Drowleth wants to continue our partnership," Rowena smiled, the expression carrying warmth that extended far beyond professional collaboration. "Actually, I've been thinking about that. The state has approved your permit application for the Wildlife Rehabilitation Facility, and there's funding available for expanding the program to serve other injured animals in the region." Calvin felt something settle into place, not the heavy weight of obligation, but the lighter feeling of purpose freely chosen. "Are you saying we could make this permanent?" "I'm saying we've already built something worth making permanent." Scout was just the beginning. As they drove home through the valley where Scout was beginning her wild life, Calvin found himself imagining the future they might build together. A facility that could serve dozens of injured animals, research opportunities that could contribute to regional conservation efforts, a partnership that honored both professional excellence and personal connection. Most importantly, he could envision Ethan growing up in an environment where caring for vulnerable creatures was normal, where scientific curiosity was encouraged, where the healing of individual animals contributed to larger ecological health. Scout's journey back to wildness had created the foundation for something larger than any of them had initially imagined, a commitment to ongoing stewardship that would outlast any individual animal's rehabilitation and would continue growing long after Scout's integration with the wild pack was complete. 1 year later, Calvin stood on the observation platform of what had become the Pine Valley Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, watching Ethan guide a group of visiting school students through the facility that now housed 3 recovering animals: an injured red-tailed hawk, a young black bear cub, and a fox kit that had been orphaned in a road accident. The transformation had been remarkable. What began as an emergency response to one injured wolf pup had evolved into a regional resource for wildlife rehabilitation, research, and education. Rowena's expertise and Calvin's practical skills had combined to create something neither could have built alone: a place where healing happened daily, where second chances were the norm rather than the exception. "The hawk should be ready for release next week," Rowena said, joining Calvin on the platform with 2 cups of coffee and the kind of comfortable familiarity that had developed between them over months of shared purpose and deepening partnership. Calvin accepted his coffee, noting the engagement ring that still felt new on Rowena's finger, 3 months after he'd proposed during a late evening feeding session with the bear cub. Their relationship had grown as naturally as Scout's rehabilitation, built on mutual respect, shared values, and the recognition that some partnerships make both individuals stronger than they were alone. "And the bear cub?" Calvin asked. "Another month, probably. She's demonstrating excellent foraging behaviors, but we want to make sure her den-building instincts are fully developed before winter sets in." Through the facility's windows, Calvin could see Ethan explaining animal behavior to the visiting students with the confidence of someone who had discovered his calling early. At 12, Ethan was already talking about veterinary school and conservation biology, his notebooks filled with detailed observations, and his weekends dedicated to wildlife research, projects that impressed even Rowena's university colleagues. Sound of distant howling drifted across the valley. Scouts pack announcing their presence, claiming territory, raising young. Trail cameras had documented Scout's continued integration and her role in successfully raising 2 pups of her own. She had become not just a survivor, but a contributor to the wild community's ongoing health and stability. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd driven past that night?" Rowena asked. Calvin considered the question, thinking about the man he'd been 18 months ago, isolated, grief-stricken, focused on survival rather than growth. "I think I would have stayed stuck in the past instead of building toward the future," Rowena smiled. "Scout saved us as much as we saved her." As they watched Ethan's animated explanation of wildlife rehabilitation techniques, Calvin reflected on the truth of that observation. Scout's journey back to wildness had taught them all something essential about healing. That recovery wasn't about returning to what had been, but about discovering what was possible when broken things were given the chance to become whole again. Pine Valley Wildlife Rehabilitation Center would continue growing, helping dozens of animals each year while teaching the next generation of conservationists. Scout's legacy lived not just in her own successful return to the wild, but in the ongoing commitment to ensuring that no injured animal would face recovery alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.